The Christmas Coffee Shop Murder, a Miss Marple Mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple Mystery. I'm Sam, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do? Or what did you do for a living? Maybe you're a chef, a gardener, an artist, or something wonderfully unique. Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy discovering more about our amazing community. Now let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. Snowfall and Speculation. Snow had fallen softly through the night, blanketing St. Mary Mead in a hush that felt almost reverent. By morning, the village roofs wore a gentle white cap, and the cobbled streets glistened faintly beneath the pale winter sun. Yet beneath the calm, whispers stirred like restless birds. The holly cup, usually a beacon of warmth and cheer, stood dark and shuttered. Its door, once painted a cheerful green, now bore the dull gleam of a police seal. Outside the bakery, Mrs. Price leaned close to the postmistress, voices low as they exchanged the latest rumour. "Poison, they say," one breathed. "In his own shop on Christmas Eve." The other shook her head gravely. Or perhaps not poison at all. Some say it was his heart. Still strange, isn't it? That man never looked ill a day in his life. At the corner, Miss Marple walked at her usual measured pace, her umbrella neatly folded, her hat pinned precisely. To a passer-by she might have seemed merely out for a morning stroll, but her eyes, bright and steady behind her spectacles, missed nothing: the half-melted footprints by the cafe window, the faint scent of burnt sugar lingering in the air, and the way people paused mid-sentence as she approached. Gossip, she thought, travelled faster than the milk cart. When she reached the holly cup, she paused, peering through the frosted glass. Inside, two constables moved quietly, one jotting notes, the other collecting cups into paper wrappings. "Evidence," Miss Marple murmured softly. A moment later, young Sergeant Lane emerged, brushing snow from his sleeves. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said politely, though his tone carried the weight of a sleepless night. "Nothing for you to worry about here. Just routine?" "I dare say it is," she replied, smiling faintly, "though I imagine poor Mr. Hale would have preferred less routine and more cheer." Her voice was kind, but her gaze slipped past him into the room. One table near the counter still bore two chairs, one pushed neatly in, the other slightly askew. On the saucer rested a teaspoon pointing east, not west. It meant little to most, but to Miss Marple disorder always spoke. She left the constable to his duties and walked on, turning the details over gently in her mind. Mr. Hale had been well liked, though not without secrets. Men rarely are. A misplaced spoon, a second chair, a whiff of unfamiliar perfume, each a thread perhaps in a tapestry not yet revealed. She would, of course, say nothing yet. Time and tea were allies in understanding such things. Back home, she set water to boil and drew her curtains wide. Outside, the snow glowed gold with morning light. From somewhere down the lane came the peal of church bells, bright, unbothered, eternal. Miss Marple poured herself a cup, added precisely one sugar, and watched the steam curl upward. "Poisoned coffee," she murmured. "Or poisoned intentions?" Her knitting needles clicked gently as she began her first row. Somewhere in the quiet village, truth had stirred, and Miss Marple, as always, was listening. 4 days after the tragedy, the holly cup opened its doors once more. The snow had thickened, turning the lane into a ribbon of white, and the village seemed eager to return to normal life, or something resembling it. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Open for Christmas cheer." Inside, the air was heavy with roasted beans and cinnamon, the scent doing its best to mask what memory refused to forget. Miss Marple entered quietly, brushing snow from her coat. She offered the new barista a gentle smile. "A cup of your house blend, my dear. Something warm for this weather." Clara, slim, pale and trying far too hard not to tremble, nodded and busied herself behind the counter. The hiss of the espresso machine filled the silence that followed. Around her, familiar faces murmured in hushed tones. Mrs. Price stirred her coffee more than she drank it. Young Mr. Townsend, the local bookseller, read a newspaper he never turned. The chatter was softer, thinner, as though fear had joined their morning routine. And when someone said Mr. Hale's name, even in a whisper, Clara's hands froze mid-pour. Miss Marple observed kindly, her expression the picture of harmless interest.
"You've kept the decorations," she noted.
"That's good. Places need cheer after sorrow." Clara nodded without meeting her eyes. "Mr. Hale loved Christmas," she said quietly. "He said the coffee tasted sweeter in December." Her voice cracked, and she turned quickly to the counter to fetch another cup. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the faint trace of perfume lingering near the register, floral,
unfamiliar and oddly out of place in the scent of roasted beans.
She glanced toward the back, where another employee, a tall man polishing silver trays, avoided her gaze entirely. She took a slow sip of her coffee. It was good, strong, with a hint of almond. "You brew beautifully," she said. Clara smiled weakly. "Thank you. It's the same recipe, but it doesn't feel the same." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless. Inside, Miss Marple let the silence stretch, knowing silence was often the best listener. Secrets, after all, preferred warmth to confession, and the holly cup had warmth enough for both. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Steam. The holly cup was quiet that afternoon. The hum of the espresso machine and the occasional clink of cups, the only interruptions to the soft patter of snow against the windows. Miss Marple sat near the counter, her knitting bag at her feet, while Clara moved about with careful, measured motions. There was an unease in her posture, a tremor in the way she handled the sugar spoon, a nervous glance toward the door whenever a customer entered. Miss Marple's eyes followed her gently,
noting the tension, the small signs that spoke louder than words.
"You seem troubled, my dear," she said softly, as though discussing the weather rather than curiosity or suspicion. "Perhaps a cup of something warm would help." Clara's hands stilled for a moment. Then she nodded, her eyes dropping to the counter.
I don't know if I should say anything," she whispered, voice barely audible. "It's nothing."
"Nothing important." Miss Marple leaned forward, folding her hands neatly. "Sometimes what seems small is the key to understanding." Her tone was calm, inviting, a gentle encouragement rather than pressure. "Do you remember the morning of Mr. Hale's last cup?"
"Anything unusual?"
Clara's fingers twisted the edge of her apron. Yes, something did happen.
"I saw, someone slip a note into his pocket. I didn't see the face, only the hand." Her voice faltered. "I'm too frightened to tell who it was." Miss Marple smiled slightly, offering a patient pause. "It's quite all right to be cautious, my dear."
Sometimes the safest step is simply noticing details. Clara swallowed hard, the snow outside framing her trembling form with quiet light.
"I remember the hand," she said softly.
"It wore a red glove." "That's all I saw." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "A red glove, you say?"
"How interesting. Red is such a bold choice for winter, wouldn't you agree?"
"And yet it seems to have chosen its owner carefully, leaving only the hint, not the whole story." Clara's lips quivered.
"I didn't know what to do. I only watched, and then he drank his coffee, and that was the last I saw him alive." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene, but her mind alert. "Thank you, my dear."
"You've been very brave. Sometimes seeing and remembering is more important than speaking at once. And now we have a clue, small as it is, that may guide us quietly forward." Outside, the snow swirled against the windows like powdered sugar over a cake, and the warmth of the cafe held both comfort and the first whisper of revelation. A red glove, simple, visual, and unmistakable, had entered the story, leaving Miss Marple to consider who had chosen it and why. The vicarage was warm and faintly scented with lavender polish, the kind of house where cushions were always plumped and the kettle always near boiling. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, as Mrs. Davies, the vicar's wife, poured the tea with practised grace. Outside, church bells marked the fading afternoon, and the garden glistened with ice like glass petals. "It's such a dreadful thing," Mrs. Davies said, her voice soft but eager.
Oh, poor Mr. Hale, such a pleasant man.
"Though I must say I always felt there was something on his mind these last weeks."
Attention, you know.
"The sort one feels rather than sees," Miss Marple nodded, stirring her tea slowly. "Business worries, perhaps?" "Oh, quite possibly." Mrs. Davies lowered her voice, leaning closer as though the curtains might be listening. "You see, I happened to overhear something. Pure accident, of course, just outside the post office last Tuesday. Mr. Hale was speaking rather sharply to a gentleman I didn't recognize. Tall, dark coat, foreign manner, perhaps. He said, and I quote, 'You wouldn't dare close the shop before Christmas.' The other man laughed, quite nastily. I thought, and replied, 'You'll see what I dare.' Then they went their separate ways." Miss Marple's spoon paused mid-stir. "Indeed," she murmured. "And did you hear anything else?" "Only that the stranger called him Dorian. No one here does."
It struck me as familiar, intimate even. Mrs. Davies frowned. "I thought it rather odd, but I didn't mention it. One doesn't like to spread tales." "Of course not," said Miss Marple kindly.
"But sometimes tales have a way of spreading themselves." She took a slow sip, considering. An argument before the murder, a threat about closing the cafe, money or pride, perhaps both. The holly cup had always seemed successful, yet she'd noticed the cheaper beans in the latest blend, the slightly thinner cream, little economies that spoke of strain. She set her cup down, eyes bright behind her spectacles.
"Thank you, my dear."
"You've been most helpful." As the clock struck 4, Miss Marple rose to leave. Snowflakes drifted beyond the window panes, soft and white, but her thoughts were already darker, turning from poison to profit, from gossip to motive. Chapter 3. A Trail of Cinnamon and Lies. The holly cup smelled of cinnamon and freshly baked scones that morning, a cosy haven against the sharp winter air outside. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting paused in her lap, watching the slow dance of snowflakes across the lane. The bell above the door tinkled softly, and Clara looked up with a faint start, brushing flour from her hands. A man entered, tall and sharply dressed, his overcoat tailored, gloves polished, and scarf neatly folded. He carried himself with a confidence that seemed almost deliberate, as though every movement had been rehearsed. "Good morning," he said smoothly, addressing Clara. "I'm from the coffee supplier. I believe we have a matter to discuss regarding Mr. Hale's latest orders." Clara glanced nervously at Miss Marple, her hands tightening around the edge of the counter.
"Of course," she replied cautiously. I can fetch the records." "Necessary," the man interrupted, waving a hand.
"I only need a few answers." He scanned the shop with precise eyes, lingering just a moment too long on Miss Marple, who returned his gaze without a flicker of acknowledgement. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the way he shifted weight from one polished shoe to the other, how his eyes followed every movement behind the counter, and how he asked questions that seemed designed less to gather facts than to unsettle.
"Curious," she murmured to herself.
One who watches too closely often fears the truth. He asked about shipments, blends, and even the ledger that Clara had shown her earlier. His attention to detail was unnerving, and yet he offered no credentials beyond a vague company name. Miss Marple nodded along politely, letting him speak, storing each observation carefully in her mind. When he finally left, bowing as though he had been a guest rather than an intruder, Miss Marple leaned toward Clara. "Did anything strike you as odd about him?" Clara nodded, frowning.
"Yes, everything, his questions."
"The way he watched."
"He didn't seem real."
"Like someone practicing a role." Later, after the cafe emptied, Miss Marple inquired quietly at the supplier's office in town. The clerk blinked at her, confused. "No one by that name has worked with us," he said. "We've no record of a visit here at all." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her knitting needles still. "A man without a past," she murmured, "is rarely a good sign." She traced the outline of his sharp coat and precise gestures in her mind, layering them over the puzzle pieces already forming, the poisoned cup, the red glove, and now a stranger obsessed with trivial details. Outside, the snow had thickened, muffling the world in white. Inside, the shop remained warm and fragrant, but for Miss Marple, the calm was deceptive. Every shadow, every carefully polished surface held secrets waiting for her quiet attention. And this stranger, she decided, would not be easily forgotten or forgiven. The morning sun slanted through the cafe windows, turning the steam from the coffee machine into drifting ribbons of gold. Miss Marple sat at her usual table, her knitting bag resting by her side, while Clara stacked cups behind the counter. The holly cup had regained its rhythm, customers chatting softly, teaspoons clinking, the faint strains of a carol humming from the radio. Yet, beneath the comfort lingered something unsettled, like a single, discordant note in a pleasant tune. When the last customer left, Clara sighed and reached for a cloth. "I can't thank you enough for helping, Miss Marple," she said, brushing a wisp of hair from her face. "Mr. Hale's things are still everywhere, and I don't quite know what to keep." "Tidying helps the heart as much as the shop," Miss Marple replied. "Order often brings understanding." Together they lifted boxes, sorted papers, and dusted shelves that hadn't been touched since before Christmas. It was while wiping the lower shelf behind the counter that Miss Marple's hand brushed against something wedged tight in the shadows, a thick notebook, edges yellowed with time. She drew it out carefully. "Well, now, what's this?" Clara blinked. "Oh, that's the old ledger. Mr. Hale kept everything in there. Recipes, expenses, ideas for blends. He said it was his Bible." Miss Marple opened it gently. The pages smelled faintly of coffee and ink. One half contained neat lists, sugar, cream, imported beans, each line annotated with dates and amounts. The other half held handwritten recipes, notes about flavor and temperature, and occasional scribbles about new mixtures. But as she turned to the final section, her fingers stopped. A page had been torn cleanly away, the ragged edge still clinging to the binding. She examined the remaining fragments, fine paper, expensive, and very recently torn. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "One doesn't usually destroy one's own bookkeeping." Clara leaned in, frowning. "It must have come loose." "Oh, no," said Miss Marple softly. "This was no accident. Someone wanted this particular page gone." She peered closer, noticing faint impressions on the sheet beneath, as though someone had written hard upon the missing page. "Do you see, my dear? The date just visible at the top, December 23rd. Clara's eyes widened.
"That's the day before." "Quite," said Miss Marple.
"Before Mr. Hale's unfortunate passing." Her voice remained calm, but her mind was already arranging possibilities. A recipe recorded, a transaction perhaps, or a name written in haste. People rarely tear out truth without good reason, and never so close to calamity. She closed the ledger and handed it to Clara. "Best keep this safe, my dear. Sometimes what remains is as telling as what's gone." Then she rose, taking her coat from the peg. The scent of roasted beans followed her to the door, mingling with the crisp air outside. The missing page fluttered in her thoughts like an unspoken confession, and Miss Marple, smiling faintly, knew that sooner or later it would speak. Chapter 4. The Scent of Perfume. The holly cup was unusually bright that morning, sunlight spilling through the frosted windows and glinting off the brass fixtures. Miss Marple had taken her customary place by the window, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. The shop was busy again. Christmas week always brought visitors to St. Mary Mead, and the air was alive with cheerful chatter. Yet, amid the bustle, Miss Marple's sharp eyes fixed on a woman who seemed just slightly too polished for village life. She arrived in a flurry of silk and confidence, a tall, graceful lady in a lilac coat trimmed with fur, a hat angled just so, and gloves that gleamed faintly when they caught the light. Her perfume reached the table before she did, delicate, powdery, unmistakably lilac. It hung in the air like a whisper of spring in the dead of winter. Miss Marple's brow lifted almost imperceptibly. The same fragrance had lingered near Mr. Hale's chair on the morning he died. The woman ordered, with a voice that carried, clear, refined, and faintly theatrical. "A cappuccino, if you please, my dear, and perhaps a slice of the lemon tart." Clara nodded quickly. eyes wide, hands trembling slightly as she set about the order. The lady smiled, satisfied, and turned her attention to the room. Her gaze skimmed over Miss Marple, dismissing her as harmless background, just as many had, to their later regret. Village gossip was seldom slow. Mrs. Penrose, someone had said, a recent arrival staying at the manor on the hill. Wealthy, widowed, charming, but with a reputation that followed her like perfume. She spoke easily to everyone, and yet nothing about her seemed open. Every smile was measured, every laugh precise. Miss Marple watched her fingers trace the rim of her cup, restless, distracted, betraying a mind not entirely at ease. When Mrs. Penrose rose to leave, she dropped a glove, soft leather, pale violet. Miss Marple, ever helpful, stooped to pick it up. "Excuse me, my dear," she said pleasantly. "You left this behind." The woman turned, her eyes sharp but quickly softened. "How very kind. Thank you." She took the glove, but her hand lingered just a second too long on Miss Marple's. "You're observant." "One tries to be," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. As Mrs. Penrose swept out into the cold, the lilac scent remained, delicate and haunting. Miss Marple watched her disappear into the street, her mind quietly sifting details. Perfume, she thought, was an intimate choice, rarely worn by accident, never unnoticed by design, out of season, out of place, and perhaps out of innocence. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled softly, casting gentle shadows that danced across lace curtains and well-loved books. Evening had settled over St. Mary Mead, the village cloaked in quiet. Miss Marple was content with her tea when a hesitant knock disturbed the peace. On her doorstep stood Mrs. Penrose. No lilac coat tonight, only a dark shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. The confident air she'd worn at the coffee shop was gone. Her eyes darted restless, and her voice trembled as she asked, "May I come in, Miss Marple?" "Just for a moment?" Miss Marple smiled kindly and ushered her inside. The woman sank into the armchair by the fire, her gloved hands twisting together.
"I hardly know where to begin," she murmured.
"People are talking, and I can't bear the thought of what they must think." "Tea helps most things," Miss Marple offered gently, pouring her guest a cup. "And sometimes a little honesty does too." Mrs. Penrose stared into the flames. "It wasn't what they say. Mr. Hale and I, yes, we met often, but it was business, nothing more. We were negotiating a partnership.
A new chain of coffee shops with his blends and my capital. He wanted it to be our legacy." Her lips quivered.
But then he changed his mind. Miss Marple's eyes softened, her knitting needles still.
"Changed his mind?"
Mrs. Penrose nodded quickly. "He said he couldn't go through with it."
"Something about old debts, old enemies." He was frightened. Her gaze flicked toward Miss Marple, desperate for belief.
"I went to see him that night to make him reconsider."
"I never wanted—" Her voice caught, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth.
"He wasn't supposed to die." For a moment only the fire spoke. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression unreadable. "Fear," she said at last, "has a way of making truth sound like guilt. But the difference, my dear, is in what one hides afterward." Tears welled in Mrs. Penrose's eyes.
"I tore out the ledger page," she confessed, voice breaking.
"It mentioned me by name, and I didn't want anyone to think I'd had reason to harm him." Miss Marple reached across, laying a gentle hand over hers.
"That was unwise," she said softly, "but not wicked."
"You feared scandal, not justice?" Mrs. Penrose nodded miserably, dabbing at her eyes. "You believe me, then?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that you've told me most of the truth, and that the rest will find its way to light soon enough." As the lady rose to leave, the fire dimmed, and the scent of lilac lingered faintly behind her, fading now, fragile as trust. Miss Marple watched her go, thoughtful and calm. A confession, yes, but not yet the whole story. Chapter 5. Frost on the Windows. The morning light slipped through the clouds like a pale blessing, glinting across the snow-bound roofs of St. Mary Mead. The holly cup stood quiet beneath its garlanded eaves, the signboard dusted white. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the path, her eyes narrowing at the ground. Snow? after all, was a terrible liar. It remembered everything. 2 sets of footprints led from the side door, winding across the narrow lane before vanishing beneath the drift near the gate. One set was light and neat, the stride careful. The other, longer, heavier, pressed deep into the snow, each step deliberate. Miss Marple bent a little, adjusting her scarf against the cold, and studied the difference. A woman and a man, she thought.
One nervous, one confident.
The small print turned inward, as if hesitating. The larger one faced straight ahead. Inside, the coffee shop hummed with soft conversation and the clatter of cups. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and polish, as though Clara had tried to scrub away tragedy with scented cloths. Miss Marple greeted her kindly and ordered a cup of coffee, her tone casual, her eyes not at all so. As Clara turned to fetch the pot, Miss Marple's attention drifted toward the little cloakroom at the back. Rows of boots stood neatly on the mat, melted snow pooling beneath them. She took a polite glance, nothing more obvious than that, and noticed a pair of small brown boots near the door, soles faintly patterned with flowers. Clara's, surely. But beside them stood a heavier pair, recently cleaned, their leather dark and new. Strangers rarely left their boots behind, yet there they were, freshly wiped, as though someone wanted them unnoticed. When Clara returned, Miss Marple smiled gently. "A busy morning, I see." "Oh, yes," Clara said too quickly. "Everyone's been kind. It helps to stay open, you know, to keep busy." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, stirring her cup. "And snow helps too. It reminds us who's come and gone." Clara's hand faltered on the tray just for a second. Miss Marple caught it, tucked the moment neatly away, and took a slow sip of coffee. Outside, the footprints were already fading beneath a new flurry, but the pattern, small and large, hesitant and firm, was safely kept in her mind, where snow could never melt it. By the next morning, the talk around the village had shifted once again. The vicar's wife spoke of nothing else at the grocer's, and even the postman lingered at each gate, repeating the newest rumour. The safe at the Holly Cup was found empty.
Not forced open, not smashed, merely open.
Miss Marple listened to it all as she folded her letters, her brows softly raised. She had seen many forms of greed, from the petty to the proud, but this one, she thought, had a curious neatness about it. Later, when she passed the cafe, she found Inspector Cray standing by the door, rubbing his hands for warmth. "Odd business," he muttered when he saw her. "Safe cleaned out, yet all the papers left behind. Even the ledger. If it were common theft, they'd have taken the lot." "Ah," Miss Marple said mildly. "But thieves of refinement prefer to leave what cannot be pawned. Truth, for instance." He gave her a half smile, uncertain whether she teased him. "We'll trace the notes, of course," he said.
"Yes, do," she replied.
"Though I wonder if you'll find the real loss in the ledger rather than the safe." When he went back inside, Miss Marple lingered near the window. The glow of the lamps inside caught the dust in the air, floating like fine frost. Clara was wiping the counter again, slower this time, her eyes dull from worry. Beside her sat that same old ledger, still open, its pages fluttering faintly in the draught. Miss Marple's gaze softened. So much fuss over missing pounds when the real theft had already occurred. The theft of peace, of honesty, perhaps even of friendship. People, she thought, were often more frightened of losing their reputation than their money. Outside, snowflakes began to drift again, silent and cold. The inspector would chase coins and receipts. Others would chase gossip. But Miss Marple, walking home beneath her umbrella, knew the trail to follow was neither written nor counted. It lay in what people didn't say, the spaces between their words, the kind of silence money could never fill. Chapter 6. The Cup That Killed. The Holly Cup felt strangely hollow that morning, its warmth replaced by whispers. Miss Marple arrived quietly, wrapped in her pale blue shawl, her step light as falling snow. She asked for nothing, only observed, her eyes, as ever, taking in the details others passed over. On a side table near the window stood a neat row of porcelain cups, each washed but not polished. Clara had left them to dry in the pale sunlight, the steam of the kettle curling faintly in the air. Miss Marple moved closer, her fingers hovering above the delicate rims. There was something terribly final about cups left unwashed after tragedy, as though the tea itself had refused to settle. She asked, gently, whether she might help tidy them, and Clara, grateful for the company, nodded, retreating to the back. One by one, Miss Marple lifted the cups, noting the faint traces of lipstick, the smudge of sugar along a saucer's edge.
Only one cup caught her attention.
Its inside glistened faintly, almost oily beneath the light. She leaned closer. Yes, a thin sheen that smelled faintly of almonds. Cyanide, she thought at once. The odour was unmistakable, though faint, softened by milk and thyme. Yet the realization brought more questions than answers. The inspector's report had been clear. Mr. Hale's drink tested positive for poison. But this cup, this was not the one he'd used. Its handle bore no sign of his grip, no chip where he habitually rested his thumb. It was cleaner, newer, and more troubling still, the mark of coffee on the saucer showed it had been poured after the time of his death. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, though her mind turned swiftly. Someone had poisoned a cup to look like the fatal one, but too late. Why? To mislead the police? Or to protect someone else? She set the cup down as carefully as if it were glass, spun from truth itself. When Clara returned, Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You've been most thorough, my dear."
One can tell a great deal from a cup, especially one that shouldn't exist. As she left, she glanced back once at the row of china gleaming beneath the light.
There it sat, innocent as any other. Yet to her eyes it gleamed like a mirror, reflecting deceit rather than drink. A poisoned cup, untouched, meant not to kill, but to convince. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned home. The snow outside, glowing faintly, rose beneath the fading sun. Her parlour fire burned low, yet her mind burned bright with thought. The poisoned cup, so carefully planted, so suspiciously late, had puzzled her. But now, as she replayed each moment in the café, a small truth began to take shape. Mr. Hale had been a creature of habit. Always the same seat by the window, always 2 sugars, and always, he fetched his own coffee when Clara was busy. Clara, on the other hand, was too kind for her own good, accepting small gifts from regulars, trusting every smile that crossed her counter. Miss Marple remembered now. That day, one of the customers, Mrs. Penrose perhaps, or another, had insisted on bringing Clara a special blend, a holiday surprise. Clara had blushed, laughed, and placed it near the kettle. A cup meant as a kindness, and that, Miss Marple thought, was precisely how evil liked to travel, dressed as goodwill. She reached for her knitting, her fingers moving automatically as her thoughts flowed. Mr. Hale had died, not Clara, because of one simple gesture. He'd noticed her busy hands and, with the easy gallantry of a gentleman, had taken the wrong cup to her table himself, a small act of helpfulness and his undoing. By evening, she walked again to the holly cup. The lamps were lit, the air thick with roasted beans and pine garland. Clara stood behind the counter, pale but smiling weakly at the few customers who braved the cold. Miss Marple waited until the room had thinned before speaking. "My dear," she began softly, "did anyone give you coffee as a gift before that dreadful evening?" Clara frowned, then nodded slowly. "Yes, Mrs. Penrose did. Said it was a French roast she'd brought back from London."
"I never even opened it. I meant to." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle, though her voice carried the quiet weight of truth.
"You must be very thankful then that you didn't. Mr. Hale, I believe, drank your kindness in your place." Clara's eyes widened, her hand trembling against the counter. Tears filled them, part grief, part gratitude. Miss Marple took her hand, warm and steady. "You see, my dear," she said, "sometimes life spares us in the smallest, kindest ways, by letting goodness misplace itself." Outside, snow fell heavier, muting the world in white. Inside, the truth settled like thawing frost. A man had died not by cruelty alone, but by a kindness turned cruel. Chapter 7. Truth Under Tinsel. The vicarage drawing-room glowed with golden lamplight and the gentle crackle of a winter fire. Outside, the village lay draped in soft snow, but inside, warmth and cinnamon filled the air. Miss Marple, in her rose-coloured cardigan, moved about the room with quiet grace, arranging mince pies on a silver tray and topping glasses with steaming mulled wine. It was, she explained modestly, a little gathering before Christmas, just neighbours.
Of course, yet everyone invited shared one delicate thread. They had all been at the Holly Cup on the night of Mr. Hale's death.
Clara arrived first, pale but resolute, carrying a small bouquet of holly as thanks. The vicar and his wife followed, cheerfully concealing their curiosity beneath good manners. Mrs. Penrose came last, wrapped in lilac silk despite the cold, her perfume, light but unmistakable, trailing behind her like a secret, unwilling to fade. They spoke at first of ordinary things, the snowstorm predicted for Christmas Eve, the price of oranges at the grocer's, and the choir's dreadful attempt at Good King Wenceslas. Miss Marple listened, smiling, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. She allowed comfort to settle before she gently disturbed it. "It's remarkable," she said, "how a single cup of coffee can alter so many lives. I suppose none of us think of how easily our fates might be stirred into something as simple as cream and sugar." The silence that followed was soft but deep. The vicar cleared his throat. Clara lowered her gaze. Mrs. Penrose toyed with her necklace, smiling too brightly. Miss Marple poured more wine, as though she'd said nothing unusual at all. "I'm so grateful," she added mildly, "that we can gather without fear now that the police are closing in on their conclusions." "Closing in?" Mrs. Penrose asked, her voice a touch too high. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Once one knows who the true target was, everything becomes terribly clear." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the fire popped sharply, scattering a little ash into the hearth. Miss Marple smiled into her teacup. The evening had only just begun, and already the air shimmered with truths waiting, ever so politely, to be revealed. Miss Marple waited until the conversation lulled, until the laughter had softened into the hum of a clock and the faint clink of cups. Then, with her characteristic delicacy, she leaned forward and said, "You know,
I've been thinking about that poor little coffee shop and the things people leave behind." She reached into her knitting basket and drew out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper.
When she unfolded it, a hush fell over the room. Inside lay a single red glove, crimson leather, the fingers faintly stained. Even across the table, the faint, sweet scent of almonds drifted like a memory. Mrs. Penrose gasped, one hand flying to her throat. Where did you find that?" "Behind the counter," Miss Marple said calmly, "tucked near the ledger, as if dropped in haste. I dare say it was meant to be retrieved later." Her eyes twinkled kindly. "You see, I recognize the perfume. Lilac, quite distinctive. But that wasn't all. The faintest trace of almond oil remained on the glove, enough to link it to the poisoned cup." Mrs. Penrose trembled, her voice breaking.
"I swear I never meant to kill any. I only wanted to frighten her," Miss Marple said gently.
To frighten Clara into silence, wasn't it? About the false investment scheme you and Mr. Hale were planning. When she discovered his deceit, you feared exposure. So you planned a little demonstration, something that would make her too fearful to speak. But you didn't know about the second blend of coffee, the one provided by the so-called supplier. At this, the vicar frowned. "Supplier?" Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Hale's brother, I believe. He came back under another name, seeking revenge for old financial ruin. He delivered the coffee himself, quite certain it would reach his brother's cup. Poetic, really, a poison brewed from bitterness and business both." Mrs. Penrose sank into her chair, tears pooling in her eyes. "He said he'd handle it, that no one would get hurt."
"I never imagined—" "No? Few do when pride meets desperation." Clara rose pale and stricken.
"So it wasn't my fault?"
"Not my blend, not my—" "My dear," Miss Marple interrupted softly, "you were the mercy in it all."
Had Mr. Hale not switched the cups, it would be your name the village whispers now. The fire crackled,
steady and low as the truth settled like fresh snow, soft
but final. Mrs. Penrose sobbed quietly, and the vicar's wife reached to comfort her. Miss Marple, meanwhile, folded the red glove back into its paper. She sighed, a faint, thoughtful sound. "It's a curious thing," she said, "how family quarrels and prideful hearts can steep into tragedy. Forgiveness once curdled poisons faster than any cup." Chapter 8. Calm After the Storm. Christmas morning dawned soft and golden, the snow on the rooftops glinting like spun sugar. St. Mary Mead, so lately burdened by whispers, now hummed again with life. Bells rang from the church tower, their notes carrying across the frosted fields, and ribbons of smoke curled from chimneys like ribbons on gift boxes. Peace, long delayed, had returned. The Holly Cup reopened that morning, its windows bright with garlands and the scent of gingerbread drifting into the lane.
Laughter spilled from the doorway. Real laughter this time, not the brittle kind born of nerve.
Villagers crowded the counter for their Christmas treats, praising Clara's bravery in keeping the shop alive. She smiled, still a little pale, but her hands were steady now as she poured each cup. At her favourite table by the window sat Miss Marple, wrapped in her soft grey shawl, a small holly pin glinting at her collar. She stirred her coffee gently, letting its warmth rise to her cheeks. Clara brought her a plate of shortbread shaped like stars. "You've been our good angel," she said with quiet sincerity. Miss Marple chuckled.
"Oh, my dear, angels are far too noisy for me."
"I simply like things tidy, truth most of all." Outside, children played in the drifts, tossing snowballs that burst like laughter. Through the glass, the village looked almost like one of those snow globes one shakes and sets upon the mantel. Beautiful, still, whole. Even Inspector Cray stopped by, offering a polite nod to Clara and a quiet thank you to Miss Marple before retreating with his cup. The old woman watched him go, then turned her gaze toward the square. The world, she thought, has a way of mending itself if one allows it time and a little kindness. The shadows that had lingered over the village were gone now, melted into morning light. As she sipped her coffee, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Somewhere beyond the chatter and clinking cups, a robin sang from the churchyard yew. Tragedy might visit even the gentlest of places, but warmth, like Christmas itself, always found its way home. The vicarage sat quiet in the late morning, curtains drawn against the sharp winter sun. Miss Marple and the vicar shared a small table near the window, steaming cups of tea, warming their hands. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily, settling on hedges and lampposts like tiny, silent witnesses. Inside, the warmth of the fire mingled with the soft murmur of conversation, the kind that leaves space for thought as much as for words. "It is remarkable," the vicar said gently, "how even a peaceful village can harbour such tension beneath the surface. One would think we had learned better by now." Miss Marple smiled, stirring her tea carefully. "Yes, indeed. But jealousy and pride are colder than the hardest winter frost. They creep quietly, leaving only the smallest signs, an overheard argument, a scent in the air, a page torn from a ledger." The vicar nodded, watching the steam rise. "And yet even when tragedy strikes, people's kindness persists. Clara, for instance, so brave, so gentle." "Brave, yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "And lucky, too. Life has a way of shielding those who act with honesty and compassion, sometimes in the most unexpected ways." They paused, listening to the distant sound of children laughing as they skated on the frozen pond. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, lingered on the scene. Human nature, she reflected, was a delicate balance of folly and virtue. People stumble, quarrel, and misjudge, but they also forgive, rebuild, and continue, each act weaving the subtle tapestry of a village's life. "The case is closed," she said finally, her voice calm, almost reflective. Yet one cannot help but wonder. There will always be pride and perhaps envy lurking in corners, ready to bloom again when least expected. The vicar smiled wistfully.
And so life continues. Precisely, she replied.
Mysteries end, yes, but human nature. Human nature never quite does. A pause fell between them, filled only by the quiet ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the hearth. Miss Marple sipped her tea, savouring its warmth, and allowed herself a small, private smile. Understanding, she thought, was far more comforting than condemnation. One could see the errors, the missteps, even the hidden intentions, and still hold one's heart gently toward those involved. As the snow drifted silently past the window panes, she reflected that St. Mary Mead would endure, as it always had, its streets alive with kindness, its people resilient. Mistakes might mark a season, a conversation, or a single night of misfortune, but the village would continue, warmed by laughter, generosity, and the quiet, unending thread of human goodness.